Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: don't let making a living prevent you from making a life. From the American basketball player and coach John Robert Wooden. A brief review of the last part where we started chapter 9, the pawn chain, and went through some general remarks and definitions, along with concepts of the base, two theaters of war, the attack against the pawn chain, and attack on the base strategically necessary, with illustrations given by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch begins the next part of the discussion under the following heading. Number 4. The transference of the blockade rules from the passed pawn to the chain. The exchange maneuver to bring about the substitution of a more amenable or easily controlled enemy blockader for a strong one applied to the pawn chain. It is clear to us after studying chapter 4, the passed pawn, that every enemy piece which holds in check a pawn which would otherwise be mobile must be conceived of as a blockader. Nevertheless, it must cause surprise that after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and e5, we should agree to regard the pawn at d4 and pawn at e5 as proper blockaders in our sense. And the surprise lies in seeing a pawn so described, for in general we think of pawns as being blockaded, and the role of a blockader we imagine to be reserved for an officer. This is in general true, but the pawns in a chain are pawns of a higher order, and in their functions differ from the common herd. To conceive of the pawns in a chain as blockaders would then appear to be quite correct. Recognizing this, let us now try to apply the exchange maneuver on the blockading square, with which we became acquainted in chapter 4 to the chain. The exchange we said there could only be justified if the new blockader proved themselves to be weaker than their predecessor. The same applies to the chain. An example: after e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, and knight c3, black can try to get the blockader, the pawn at d4, replaced by another, the queen at d4. In fact, after the further moves, c takes on d4, queen takes on d4, and knight c6, the queen turns out to be a blockader whom it will be difficult to maintain at her post, and hence the exchange is proved to be correct, and this in spite of a possible bishop e5. For after bishop d7, bishop takes on c6 and b takes on c6, black has two bishops and a mobile mass of pawns in the center and has the advantage. On the other hand, this exchange maneuver would be weak after e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, and bishop e3. For after c takes on d4, queen b6 is better instead, but c takes on d4 and bishop takes on d4. The bishop would be a tough customer to deal with, and a further exchange so as to be rid of the bishop, that is, say knight takes on d4 queen takes on d4, knight e7, knight f3, knight c6, and queen f4 would lead to the driving off of the blockading troops, but only at the cost of loss of time caused by the moves of the black king's knight. In this position, white stands quite well. White's pieces are placed as they would be for a kingside attack, but have also a sufficient bearing on the center. For example, f6 to roll up white's chain, bishop b5, a6, bishop takes on c6 check, b takes on c6, castling, and black will never succeed in making their pawn at e6 mobile. For if f takes on e5, then knight takes on e5, and the establishment of the knight at this point, e5, would follow. With this, we have got further towards an understanding of the pawn chain. All exchange operations in the region of a chain only take place with the object of replacing a strong enemy blockader by a weaker one. And the experience we have got from chapter 4 will be of great help here. We have, to decide in a given case whether the blockader in question is strong or weak, elastic or inelastic. And the faculty of discriminating rightly in such cases will be of enormous service to us. See, for example, the position on board. Here, queen c2 would be a weak move in spite of the sharp threat of bishop takes on f6 and bishop takes on h7. The mistake lies in the fact that white had much better have done something towards the defense of their blockading wall. For example, knight d2, castling, and knight f3. On the other hand, if queen c2, the continuation might be castling, bishop takes on f6, rook takes on f6, bishop takes on h7 check, king h8, bishop g6, or bishop d3, and e5. White, it is true, has won a pawn, but black has overcome the blockade and now stands ready to march in the center. White should lose. In the position on board, the maneuver bishop d4, queen c7, and queen e2 might be considered with the intention of following with knight e5. However, this plan to widen the blockading ring is impracticable, for after queen e2, knight g4, h3, and e5, the black pawns assert themselves, whatever countermeasures be taken. The right move is rather queen e2, and there follows rook c8, or bishop takes on e5, knight takes on e5, rook c8, and c4. So rook c8, bishop d4, queen c7, knight e5, and black is seriously blockaded. We may say therefore that the line of play bishop d4, queen c7, and queen e2 was bad for white, because the reserve blockader who was keeping watch, the knight at f3, would have but slight blockading effect, that is to say, would never succeed in reaching e5. In the notes to my game against Salve, game number 46 of the illustrative game section, from which this example is taken, we shall prove our theory of exchanges by further examples. We shall go through the entirety of this game in a short while. Moving further, Nimzowitsch begins the next part of the discussion under the following heading. Number 5. The conception of a war of movement and that of siege warfare applied to the region of the chain. The attacking party at the parting of the ways. Nimzowitsch writes, if the attacking party has played in the spirit of the explanations given in this chapter, that is to say, attack on the base, and the correct application of the exchange operation on the blockading point, it will often happen that the full freedom of their hampered pawns will be their reward. There will be times, however, when the fight they have waged with the measures here indicated will reach a dead point, and in such case the use of some new plan becomes necessary. As an example, we will take the position given on board. The opening moves of the game were e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, and queen b6. Black seeks by hook or by crook to induce white to give up the base, the pawn at d4. An attack with this purpose, one which aims at the rolling up of the chain, we class as a war of movement, of which the move queen b6 must be regarded as a part. Queen moves in the opening are as a rule out of place. Here, however, the wheel or woe of the pawn chain dictates all our action. Bishop d3 and bishop d7. A very plausible move, and since white still hesitates to make the capture, d takes on c5. Black proposes to make their decision easier by rook c8 in the coming move. The right move, however, was c takes on d4, c takes on d4, and with it to adopt other methods, namely siege or positional warfare. So bishop d7. These were the opening moves of the game number 46, Nimzowitsch versus Salve, played at Carlsbad in 1911. From first move to last, it is highly instructive. Moreover, I regard it as the first game to be played in the spirit of the new philosophy of the center which I originated. The student is advised to play through this game before proceeding further. So let's go through this game. It was played in the Carlsbad tournament of 1911 in Carlsbad or Karlovy Vary, present-day Czech Republic. Nimzowitsch describes the game as a most instructive game from A to Z, one which I regard as the first in which my new philosophy of the center was exhibited. Aron Nimzowitsch with the white pieces and George Salve with black. Notes by Nimzowitsch. Nimzowitsch began with e4 and Salve responded e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, and bishop d3. Where Nimzowitsch writes, more natural would have been bishop e2. For the pawn at d4 is the base, and as such should be protected as thoroughly as possible. Bishop e2 protects more thoroughly than bishop d3. So bishop d3 and bishop d7. Nimzowitsch comments, a very plausible move. Since white still delays d takes on c5, black intends to force his hand with rook c8. The right course was c takes on d4, c takes on d4, and thus to pass into quite other channels. See games number 19 and 20 of the illustrative games section. Please note that we shall go through both these games towards the end of this video series along with other remaining games from the illustrative games section of the book. So bishop d7, and play continued here with d takes on c5, which Nimzowitsch marks with a double exclamation indicating an excellent move. Bishop takes on c5, castling, and f6. Nimzowitsch writes, black swells in triumph and throws himself hungrily on the last remaining member of the once so proud chain family to destroy the pawn. His war cry is room for the e-pawn, but it happens quite otherwise. b4, in order to be able to provide e5 with an enduring defense. Queen e2 instead would also have been a defense, but no enduring one, for there would follow f takes on e5, knight takes on e5, knight takes on e5, queen takes on e5, knight f6, and the blockading queen at e5 will be easily driven away. So b4, bishop e7, bishop f4, f takes on e5, where Nimzowitsch remarks, again we have the exchange operation which we have so often discussed. This time, however, it is not really justified. For the new blockader, the bishop at e5 proves to be a stout fellow. Knight takes on e5, knight takes on e5, bishop takes on e5, and knight f6. Nimzowitsch writes, for the otherwise desirable bishop f6 would fail against queen h5 check, g6, bishop takes on g6 check, h takes on g6, queen takes on g6 check, king e7, bishop takes on f6 check, knight takes on f6, and queen g7 check. So knight f6 and knight d2. That the win of a pawn by queen c2 instead. Castling and so on is a snare or trap has been pointed out previously. So knight d2, castling, and knight f3. Nimzowitsch comments, the blockading forces are to be reinforced by the knight. Bishop d6. Bishop b5 instead would yield little profit for black. For bishop d4, queen a6, bishop takes on b5, queen takes on b5, and knight g5 would win a pawn for white. So bishop d6 and queen e2. That bishop d4 instead would be premature for white has been pointed out previously. So queen e2, rook c8, bishop d4, queen c7, and knight e5. Nimzowitsch writes, the immobility of the e-pawn is now greater than ever. White has utilized his resources very economically. The possibility of a successful occupation of the points d4, e5 hung on a hair. On taking minute advantage of the terrain, the points d4, e5, c2 and e2. Bishop e8, rook e1, bishop takes on e5, bishop takes on e5, queen c6 and bishop d4. Nimzowitsch comments, in order to force black's light squared bishop, which also has their eye on h5, to come to a decision, bishop d7 and queen c2, the decisive regrouping. Rook f7, rook e3, b6, rook g3, king h8, bishop takes on h7 and e5. Nimzowitsch writes, knight takes on h7 instead loses because of queen g6. So e5, bishop g6, rook e7, rook e1, queen d6, bishop e3, d4, bishop g5, rook takes on c3, rook takes on c3, d takes on c3, queen takes on c3 and white won. King g8, a3, king f8, bishop h4, bishop e8, bishop f5, queen d4, queen takes on d4, e takes on d4, rook takes on e7, king takes on e7, bishop d3, king d6, bishop takes on f6, g takes on f6, king f1, bishop c6 and h4, where black resigned the game. Returning to our discussion in the chapter prior to this game, Nimzowitsch continues, we have already said, and the course of the game shows, that at his sixth move in the position on board, black could and should have sought a quieter channel by playing c takes on d4, c takes on d4, bishop d7, with eventual knight e7 to f5. He preferred, however, to play for the complete capitulation of his opponent in the region of the chain, I mean. His plan was number one, to force white to play d takes on c5 and e takes on f6. Number two, to drive off any blockading pieces that might take their place. Number three, triumphantly to advance his center pawns now freed. His plan failed because the substitute blockaders were not to be driven away. That is to say, they had a strong blockading effect. The two following postulates are here of importance. A. It makes no difference whatever to the strangled, that is, hemmed in pawns, whether they are strangled by pawns or by officers. The operation is as painful in one case as in the other, whence it follows that b. The destruction of the cramping pawns in the chain does not in itself imply a more or less complete liberating operation. For the substitute blockaders, the pieces have still to be driven away. How and in what measure this last is possible is the question of really decisive importance. The following taken from my article, The Surrender of the Center, a Prejudice, written in 1913, may serve to throw light on the relations between pawns and pieces True, the pawns are best fitted for building up the center, since they are the most stable. On the other hand, pieces stationed in the center can very well take the place of pawns. Moreover, as we shall see later, the center can often be effectively held at long range by bishops and rooks, so that the actual occupation of the center by a pawn or pawns does not necessarily mean its control. The greater part of this article is reprinted in the second part of the book Position Play. At the moment, we would only remark that we are inclined to regard as most dangerous any liberating operation which is begun but not completed, as in Salve's attempt in the game under consideration, game number 46. Dangerous, that is to say, to the one ostensibly or apparently freeing themselves. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next part. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. A couple of new supporters, Chess on Earth and dylancuresmysoul. Chess on Earth is a fellow chess streamer from India and a good chess player. I will post a link to his stream in the video description. Do check him out. And dylancuresmysoul is Eric, a good chess player from USA who has a keen eye for inspirational writings. Thanks a lot for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care and stay safe.